The first lie about Valhalla is that it was a reward. The second is that the Valkyries were angels. If you had stood beneath the clash of their wings on a winter battlefield, you would have understood how wrong both ideas are. They were not soft, not merciful, not distant choosers of noble dead. They were instruments. And Odin did not merely ask them to carry fallen warriors home. He demanded something far darker, that they become the machinery that kept war alive, the girl who would one day understand that stood on her first battlefield with her feet not yet touching the ground. Mist coiled beneath her like half-frozen breath. She had been forged from storm and command, given form from Odin's will, and a handful of runes carved for purpose. He did not ask her name. He gave her one. Names are anchors, and Odin did not like his tools floating free. "You will be called Hildur," he said, "and you will choose the slain." She did not yet know that he meant more than choosing. She thought it was about worth. He meant it was about usefulness. She rode the wind between shattered shield walls, her horse formed from cloud and thunder. Below, men died in ways that would be softened later in song. Not cleanly, not heroically, but gasping in mud, reaching for mothers, for lovers, for gods who did not answer. She saw it all with eyes that had been made to notice courage, but trained to ignore everything that did not serve a narrative. Odin's first demand of his Valkyries was simple: see everything, feel nothing. To carry out his will, they had to watch men break and pretend that only the last clean moment mattered. At first, Hildur obeyed perfectly. She did what she had been designed to do. She hovered above the fray, watching who held the line and who broke, who ran toward death and who tried to slip away, who raised a shield over a comrade and who pushed another man forward to die in his place. The souls of the fallen glimmered as they tore free from broken flesh, rising in confusion, in terror, in disbelief. Some reached for their own bodies. Some reached for the enemy still striking at them. Some reached for nothing at all because they had not believed in anything beyond the next breath. When she extended her hand, they clung to it without understanding what they agreed to. Odin's second demand was harsher. She was not to take all the brave, only those whose bravery could be weaponized. A man who died protecting his children in a village that would never march to war was of little use to Valhalla. A warrior whose courage was bound up in defending a single hill that would never matter again was a wasted investment. Odin wanted the ones whose souls burned in a way that could be fanned into something larger: leaders. Berserkers. Men whose last thoughts were not of peace but of unfinished battles. Hildur learned quickly that worthy did not mean good. It meant combustible. On that first day, she reached instinctively for a farmer who had never held a sword before this raid, who died trying to hold a door closed so his family could flee through a back window. His soul burned with a desperate, unpracticed courage that shook even her. She stretched out her hand. The air changed. Ravens wheeled sharply in the sky. Odin's will slid between her fingers like a blade. Not that one. The command was quiet, but it cut. She felt her arm freeze mid-motion, the soul flickering in front of her with wide, confused eyes. The man's last memory, splintered wood, his wife's scream, the impact of an axe still trembled around him like a storm that hadn't passed. She wanted to take him. Odin refused. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely a thought. His reply came like a weight settling on her shoulders. "Because he is not mine. His courage dies with his door. He will not raise a spear here. He will not kill for me. Leave him." The soul sank, pulled into a current she could not see, dragged toward whatever end awaited those who did not fuel Odin's design. Hildur felt something within her resist, a flicker like a spark brushed by wind. But she had been made to obey. She turned away and reached instead for a warlord whose last act was to laugh as 3 blades pierced him, delighted to die on his feet. His soul leapt into her grasp like a dog returning to its master. This, Odin approved. This, he demanded. The third demand came later when she brought her first full cohort of chosen warriors into Valhalla. The hall was a storm of noise iron striking iron as men tested their new bodies, voices shouting to be heard over the endless roar of fires and boasts. At the far end of the hall, Odin sat upon his high seat, flanked by ravens and wolves and the weight of 1,000 unspoken calculations. Hildur felt pride rise in her chest as the warriors she had selected stood taller, seeing the bounty arrayed around them: meat, mead, weapons, immortality. Then the training began. They thought they had come to rest. Odin demanded they prepare. Day after day, she watched them die again. Not permanently this time, but in drills that bordered on cruelty. They were cut down, crushed, stabbed, drowned, burned, resurrected, and sent back into lines that never broke because the pain never truly ended. At first they believed it was an honor, a chance to hone their skills. Over time, some began to understand the truth. Valhalla was not a reward. It was a forge, and they were the metal. Hilder's third burden was to keep choosing even then. Warriors could choose not to fight. Odin did not say it, but it was true. Some, after enough cycles of death and rebirth, would falter. They would hesitate to pick up a sword. They would grow tired of endless preparation for a battle that never arrived. Odin demanded that his Valkyries watch for that fatigue and quietly remove such men from the main lines, shunting them toward the edges of the hall, assigning them tasks that felt like lesser honors. They were not cast out. They were sidelined, forgotten, a warning to others. Valhalla was not for the weary. On the 100th year of Hildra's service, though years did not mean much where she walked, she saw something. She never forgot. A man she had chosen from a frozen field in the north stood at the edge of the training ground, sword hanging loosely at his side. He had once been ferocious, the kind of warrior who laughed at wounds and ran toward the thickest crush of bodies. Now he looked at the drills with something like nausea. When the horn sounded to begin another round of practice slaughter, he did not move. Odin's voice brushed against Hilder's thoughts. "You watch him." She watched. The man flinched as another warrior's head was taken cleanly off in front of him, though it would grow back with the next feast. He tightened his grip on the hilt of his sword, then loosened it again. Finally he turned, not toward the fight, but toward the far end of the hall where the doors opened onto a fog-covered plain. No one went there. There was nowhere to go. He took one step in that direction. Odin's demand came like ice water down Hilder's spine. Take his memory. She did not understand at first. What? If he will not fight, he will not infect the others with doubt. Take his memory, strip his past. Leave him only with the present joy of food and simple labor. No fear, no questioning, no history of war. Can I not grant him rest? She asked, the spark of that first battlefield flickering again. There is no rest, only usefulness. Do as I command. She obeyed. That was what she had been made for. She descended to the man's side, laid her hand against his forehead, and pulled. His memories came away not as images, but as weight. Decades of battles, screams, losses, victories that had turned to ash. The face of a son he had barely known. The warmth of a woman who had waited for him and never seen him return. Hilder felt each one pass through her and into the invisible ledgers Odin kept somewhere beyond her sight. When it was done, the man blinked and smiled at her like a child. His sword fell from his hand. He walked back into the hall and accepted a place near the kitchens with simple, empty contentment. Hilder rose, her hand burning. Odin's fourth demand had just been written into her bones, not only to carry souls, not only to sort them, not only to deliver them into endless preparation, but to erase the parts of them that might one day refuse. That night, standing on a balcony overlooking the restless expanse of the hall, she realized something that no saga ever recited. The dark side of Valhalla was not the blood or the violence or the constant training for a final battle that might never come. It was the cost of making warriors eternal. To keep them sharp, Odin demanded that his Valkyries cut away every piece of them that longed for peace. She stared down at the throngs of laughing, shouting men, their mugs raised high, their scars worn like badges, and wondered how many of them even remembered what they had died for, or if all that remained inside them was the shape Odin had carved from the ruins. The wind shifted, carrying raven feathers and the faint metallic taste of coming orders. What Odin asked of his Valkyries was simple. He asked them to turn human lives into fuel and to never again ask what it meant. He told them from the beginning that Valhalla was a reward. That was the lie that made everything else easier to swallow. In the early days, when the first Valkyries were forged from storm and will, Odin stood before them in a hall half-built, its rafters still smelling of fresh-cut wood and blood. He spoke of honor, of duty, of guiding the bravest fallen to their rightful place. He showed them visions of warriors laughing at long tables, of endless feasts, of the training grounds where the dead would fight and fall and rise again, sharpening themselves for Ragnarok. He did not show them what happened in the quiet hours after the feasting when the weight of eternity began to sink in. He did not show them the faces of those who realized too late that they had died for a game they did not design. His first demand was simple: loyalty of the eye. Valkyries were forbidden to see war as mortals did. They were not to look at the child left fatherless, the woman kneeling in the mud beside a broken body, the men who dropped their weapons and ran because survival was the only prayer they still believed in. See only courage, he said. See only those who run toward the spear wall. It sounded noble, almost holy. But to obey it, they had to begin editing reality itself. They had to train themselves to let certain images slide out of focus, to treat human agony as background noise behind the shining figure of a chosen hero. It was the first fracture in their perception, a controlled blindness disguised as clarity. The second demand cut deeper: obedience of the hand. Choosing the fallen was never completely theirs. No matter how often he told them he trusted their judgment. In the heat of battle, they might reach for a soul that burned with a kind of quiet bravery, the kind that held a shield over someone weaker, the kind that stayed in a collapsing line when leaving meant life. And then his will would press against theirs, invisible but absolute. Not that one. Take the man beside him, the one who slaughtered 3 prisoners last winter, but shouted the right words when he charged, the one whose death at this moment would inflame the survivors just enough to keep the feud alive for another generation. The Valkyrie felt the resistance of the soul she truly believed deserved the hall, and she had to let go. Over centuries, that obedience taught them something poisonous. Worth was not measured by the heart, but by usefulness to a god who fed on unrest. The third demand came later, when Valhalla was full and the long tables groaned under the weight of another day's dead. It was the demand of maintenance. The Einherjar thought their lives had changed when they entered the hall, but the pattern was always the same: feast, drink, train, die, rise, repeat. The cycle was presented as glory, a preparation for the final battle that would give their death meaning. But in the corners of the hall, Valkyries saw something else: men whose eyes grew emptier with each resurrection, whose laughter got louder to drown out the realization that there would be no end to this until the world itself burned. Odin required his Valkyries to keep the system moving, to pour the mead, to hand over the weapons, to call the warriors to the field every dawn with the same words, as if nothing had changed. They were not just choosers of the slain. They were wardens of an eternal barracks. When one of the Einherjar broke under the repetition, when a man who had once died with joy began to flinch at the sound of the horn, Odin did not go to him. The Valkyries did. They sat beside him on the bench, their presence halfway between comfort and order, and reminded him of the songs that had once called him to war. They spoke of his life on Midgard as if it had been a prelude instead of something violently cut short. They told him that his children, his land, his unresolved grief, all of it had been traded for this higher purpose, and that turning away now would be a betrayal of everything he was. It was persuasion, but under it lay a darker truth. A warrior who refused to fight again disrupted the machinery of Valhalla, and Odin did not permit broken cogs. His fourth demand was silence. The Valkyries saw cracks in the myth long before mortals did. They noticed that some of the men at the tables were not the bravest who had fallen, but the loudest. They noticed that those who died in needless skirmishes started by wounded pride or greed for land filled the benches in greater numbers than those who had died defending something that truly mattered. They saw how often Odin nudged kings and jarls toward war instead of peace, whispering visions that made them believe the next raid, the next campaign, the next river of blood would earn them a more honored place. The Valkyries were forbidden to speak of this to each other, to the dead, to themselves. Questioning is for the Norns, he said. Your task is to carry, not to judge. But carrying without judging is not neutrality. It is complicity. There were Valkyries who tried to push back in small ways long before any dared open defiance. They lingered a heartbeat longer beside a man who died trying to shield a child, even if he was not called. They hesitated before lifting a soul tied more to harvest and family than to battlefields. Those small delays did not change the outcome, but they burned. Each hesitation was felt by Odin as a disturbance in the flow of fate, a tiny drag on the war machine he had fine-tuned across ages. His response was never immediate. Punishment came later, subtle at first. A diminished presence at the feasts. A seat moved further from his high place. Fewer words, colder glances. A reminder that favor was not a right, but a leash. And then there were the punishments everyone knew of, whispered even in mortal sagas, but stripped of their full meaning. The Valkyrie struck down by a spear of sleep, and laid on a mountain behind a wall of fire, the one bound in mortal flesh and thrown into a life she did not choose, with her memories veiled, her wings torn away. Skalds would tell these stories as if they were romantic tragedies, as if the Valkyrie's disobedience had been born from love for the wrong man or a simple mistake in battle. The truth was colder. Those were not tales of passion punished. They were case studies, public examples. Odin's way of saying to every Valkyrie, your power, your immortality, your identity, they are privileges I can revoke the moment your heart pulls in a different direction from mine. The dark side of Valhalla was not just the endless cycle of training for a war that would annihilate everything. It was the knowledge, buried deep in the bones of every Valkyrie, that they were helping sustain a system built on interrupted lives and unfinished stories. They saw the warriors who died with regrets still clenched in their teeth, the ones torn from children too young to remember them, the ones whose last thought was not of glory but of something left unsaid. They brought those souls into a hall where none of that could be acknowledged without weakening the narrative that kept them compliant. Odin demanded that the Valkyries translate unbearable loss into acceptable legend, to strip away the parts of a man's life that did not serve his role as a soldier in a god's coming war. What he demanded from them more than anything was endurance. Not the endurance of muscle or steel, but of conscience. To see the same patterns repeated for centuries and keep calling them noble. To hear the same justification, "It must be this way," and keep nodding as if necessity was not just another word for desire at scale, to feel their own doubts rising like a tide and keep them locked behind their teeth because they knew what happened to those who let them spill out. Many mortals fantasized about being chosen by a Valkyrie, about riding to Valhalla in a blaze of glory. Few ever asked what it cost the women with wings to be the ones doing the choosing. Day after day, war after war, under the eye of a god who had already decided how the story was supposed to end. And somewhere in the cracks between demands and obedience, a truth began to grow like ice in a hairline fracture of stone. The Valkyries were not simply instruments of fate. They were witnesses forced to pretend that what they saw was destiny instead of design. The darker side of Valhalla was not hidden in the mead or the blood or the endless training grounds. It was hidden in the quiet moments when a Valkyrie, standing alone at the far end of the hall, watched a warrior laugh and wondered what his life might have been if a different god had been in charge, or if no god had. All had reached down and steered his last step. By the time a Valkyrie sensed that something was wrong with the design, it was already too late to step outside it. Odin's fifth demand was the most carefully hidden of all: transformation. He did not simply want servants who carried out his will. He wanted the Valkyries themselves reshaped by the work, slowly and irreversibly, until resistance no longer felt natural. The constant exposure to death, to justified slaughter, to carefully curated heroism did not leave them unchanged. It trained their instincts. Over centuries, they began to anticipate his preferences before he voiced them. They learned which kinds of deaths pleased him most, which battles would feed Valhalla, and which would be allowed to burn themselves out. They became, without ever being explicitly ordered, extensions of his strategy rather than neutral agents of fate. This was the cruelty that left the deepest mark. Odin rarely punished immediately. He rewarded alignment, a Valkyrie whose choices consistently favored kings over farmers, wars that bred future wars over conflicts that ended cleanly, would find herself closer to his seat. She would be given greater authority, more autonomy, praised as wise, as perceptive, as uniquely attuned to the rhythms of war. The message was unmistakable. The more perfectly you embody my priorities, the more freedom you appear to have. And it worked. Valkyries who had once argued silently with his commands found themselves hesitating less. It was easier to choose the soul that felt right to Valhalla than the one that stirred a complicated ache they would carry for centuries. Those who did not adapt became liabilities. When a Valkyrie began to look too closely at the aftermath of battles, when she lingered in villages emptied by raids, when she noticed that the same regions bled generation after generation because Odin whispered ambition into the ears of new rulers, his tone toward her changed. Instructions became sharper. Patience thinned. Ravens watched her longer than necessary. Wolves tracked her movements even when she had done nothing wrong. The message was not spoken aloud, but it was understood. You are becoming unpredictable. The first stage of punishment was isolation. A Valkyrie who questioned too often would find herself assigned to lesser conflicts, skirmishes that barely registered on Odin's larger designs. She still chose the slain, but those slain mattered less. Their souls were duller, their violence smaller in scale. To a being forged for the storm of history, this was a quiet humiliation. Isolation starved Valkyries of the grand narratives they had been taught to crave. It reminded them that purpose, like favor, could be withdrawn. If isolation failed, the second stage followed: embodiment. Odin had many ways to strip a Valkyrie of her distance from pain. Bound in flesh and cast into Midgard, she would be forced to live as the very thing she had spent centuries harvesting: mortal, vulnerable, ignorant of the larger pattern. Mortality was not a gift, it was a correction. In a human body, wounds did not reset at dawn. Violence left scars that did not fade into legend. Time meant loss instead of rehearsal. Odin believed that living through fragile flesh would teach a Valkyrie to value the order she had once questioned. If she returned to him after death, her perspective suitably narrowed. She might be restored, her defiance burned away by suffering. Some never returned. The ninth realm echoed with stories of Valkyries who fell asleep behind walls of fire, whose memories blurred under the weight of human years. Skalds romanticized these tales, turning them into stories of love and tragic fate. What they rarely mentioned was the silence afterward. Once a Valkyrie walked among mortals, her influence over Valhalla ended. She could no longer adjust a single thread of the war tapestry. Odin did not have to strike her down. Removing her from the system accomplished more than execution ever could. It erased her descent without making a martyr of her. That, too, was a demand. Dissent must disappear quietly, but the most terrible punishment was reserved for the ones who did not question out of exhaustion or confusion, but out of clarity. A Valkyrie who truly understood what Odin was building and consciously chose to resist it represented a threat on a different scale. She had seen the machinery from the inside and named it for what it was. Odin could not allow that understanding to spread. Not among the Valkyries, and certainly not among the dead warriors who still believed Valhalla was the crown of existence. For these, Odin demanded erasure. Their names were removed from the songs. Their deeds were never carved into memory. Where a Valkyrie had once ridden storm clouds and chosen kings, there would be only an absence, an unexplained gap in the ranks. Other Valkyries felt it when one vanished, like a pressure change in the air, a note missing from a familiar chord. They were not allowed to ask where she had gone. Asking invited attention. Attention invited suspicion. Suspicion invited the same fate. Erasure was more than death. It was removal from the cosmic accounting that Odin so carefully maintained. A Valkyrie erased did not pass on to hell, did not linger as a shade, did not dissolve into the quiet nothingness mortals feared. She was unmade, her essence folded back into the raw forces Odin drew from, her individuality crushed into undifferentiated power. It was the final confirmation that even immortal servants were not irreplaceable. Odin did not need Valkyries to love him. He needed them to function. And still, the system persisted because understanding did not always lead to rebellion. Many Valkyries learned to manage their disquiet by reframing it. They told themselves that without Odin's design, chaos would consume the worlds. That Valhalla, brutal as it was, represented order in a universe otherwise drifting toward entropy. They clung to Ragnarok as justification, as the promised end that made all present suffering provisional. When the final battle came, when everything burned, then perhaps the endless harvesting of souls would be revealed as tragic, but necessary. This hope that there was a finish line kept many of them compliant long after the doubts had hardened. But a few noticed something unsettling. Ragnarok receded as often as it approached. The signs flared and faded, the prophecies bent. Each near collapse of the world ended with more war, more death, more souls siphoned into Valhalla's ranks. Odin never seemed concerned that the end took so long to arrive. In fact, the longer the delay, the larger his army grew. The possibility emerged, unspoken and dangerous. What if Ragnarok was not just an ending, but a justification? A horizon that made infinite accumulation of violence seem reasonable because it was always about to be resolved. The Valkyries were not fools. They saw how often Odin intervened to prolong conflict rather than end it, how peace treaties frayed at the last moment, how insult and ambition found fertile soil where compromise might once have taken root. Odin did not simply prepare for the end of the world. He managed it, shaped it, postponed it when postponement meant more warriors at his command. And the Valkyries, by choosing the slain, by managing Valhalla's endless forge, were the hands through which that postponement became reality. What Odin demanded from them in the end was not blind obedience but informed complicity, to understand enough to act efficiently but not enough to resist, to feel doubt but never to let it crystallize into refusal, to carry souls upward while bearing the truth that they were helping keep the wheel of suffering spinning. By the time a Valkyrie fully grasped this, she faced a grim choice: continue, and live with the knowledge that her wings were blackened not by battle alone but by maintenance of a system that consumed mortality as fuel, or resist and accept that Odin's response would not be dramatic but absolute. There would be no cathartic rebellion, no last stand carved into legend, only silence, disappearance, and the settling of the machine as if nothing had happened at all, and so most endured. They flew into battle after battle, their expressions carved from discipline rather than passion, their work precise and devastating. Mortals continued to tell stories of glorious deaths, of Valkyries as noble guides to eternal reward. Few ever imagined that, above the blood-soaked fields, the women with wings might be the loneliest figures of all, trapped between seeing too much and being allowed to change nothing. The lie endured because it was useful. As long as mortals believed Valhalla was a crown, they ran toward death instead of away from it. As long as warriors dreamed of Valkyries lifting them from the mud into light, they sharpened swords instead of asking who benefited from their sharpening. Odin understood something fundamental about power. It lasts longer when the ones who feed it believe they are being rewarded. His final demand of the Valkyries was to preserve that belief at any cost, even when they themselves no longer shared it. By the time Hildur had watched centuries fold in on themselves, she no longer counted battles. They blurred together into a continuous river of iron and breath and cries cut short. What stood out were the patterns, the same kind of men dying for the same kinds of reasons under banners that changed names but not intent, ambition dressed as destiny, conquest sold as protection, revenge justified as honor. She began to recognize the subtle signature of Odin's influence long before mortals did. A dream whispered to the right king, a rune glimpsed in fire, a surge of confidence at the moment compromise might have been possible. The result was always the same: another field, another culling, another infusion of new souls into Valhalla's endlessly hungry hall. Odin never stood over these fields himself. That was never his way. He did not soil his hands with the immediate reality of dying men. That was the work of mortals and Valkyries. His eye remained fixed on the long shape of history, not on individual lives. To him, 1,000 deaths were a single motion, a correction applied to the flow of the world. What he demanded from his Valkyries was alignment with that scale, to look at slaughter and see numbers, to see faces and translate them into strength ratios, to watch families fracture and classify the outcome as acceptable loss. The punishment for forgetting that alignment was never sudden. Odin's most effective discipline came from patience. A Valkyrie who faltered would feel at first as distance, less counsel, fewer commands spoken directly into her thoughts, more reliance on intermediaries, on ravens delivering clipped phrases instead of full intentions. She would sense herself becoming peripheral, her presence tolerated but no longer trusted. In a system built on proximity to decision-making, distance was a wound that deepened slowly and never healed. There came a moment, there always did, when a Valkyrie understood that Odin would never release them. Not in Ragnarok, not after it, not when the worlds burned and were remade. Even if the great battle came, even if Valhalla emptied itself in final violence, there would be another horizon beyond it, another justification, another war. Odin did not seek an ending, he sought leverage over endings. Ragnarok was not a conclusion, it was a reset. This understanding changed the meaning of everything. The endless training of the Einherjar was no longer preparation for salvation, but containment. Valhalla was not merely a forge. It was a warehouse. Warriors who might have challenged gods, questioned narratives, or refused future calls to arms were kept busy, fed, entertained, broken and rebuilt in ways that made rebellion unthinkable. The Valkyries saw that the hall did not simply prepare warriors for the end of the world. It prevented them from imagining any other kind of eternity. And still, they served. Because to stop serving was not to walk away. There was nowhere to walk. The realms were structured so that every path led back to Odin's calculus. Hell received those he did not want. Midgard bled those he needed. Valhalla refined what he harvested. The Valkyries were the connective tissue, the hands that made the theory real. Without them, the system stalled. Odin would never allow that. Mortals would never know how close some Valkyries came to open defiance, how often one of them hovered over a battlefield with her hand trembling, feeling the scream of a soul that should have been taken, and knowing she would be punished for doing so. They would never know how many nights were spent staring down at Valhalla's feasts, listening to laughter that rang too loud, wondering how much of it was genuine and how much was enforced forgetting. They would never hear the unspoken question that passed between Valkyries when Odin's gaze turned away for the briefest moment. If we stopped choosing, how long would war still be possible? That question, unanswered, was the true dark side of Valhalla. What Odin demanded from his Valkyries was not cruelty for its own sake. It was administration of suffering, management of death, a willingness to turn lived experience into raw material and never ask what else might have been built with it. He forced them to become archivists of ending stories, filing away millions of lives under a single heading, necessary. In the end, the Valkyries became something the Sagas could not comfortably describe, not angels, not monsters, but aware participants in a machine that ate meaning as efficiently as it ate flesh. The women with wings were not ignorant of the cost. They were trained to bear it in silence, to carry the weight without letting it spill into action. And that may be the most uncomfortable truth of all, that the greatest brutality in Norse mythology was not the axe, the spear, or the bloody gull carved into living backs. It was the system that convinced those who saw everything to do nothing, and taught generations of mortals to call that silence divine order. If Valhalla exists as described, it is not a heaven. It is a holding pattern sustained by belief. And the Valkyries, bound by Odin's demands and punishments, are its most tragic figures, not because they lacked power, but because they were given just enough understanding to know what they were preserving, and never enough freedom to refuse. This is what the sagas never dared to tell.